The Empire of 2000 Cities project was created by ancient historian Luc de Licht, and he invited me to co-direct the project as the archaeologist. It employed 5 PhDs and 3 postdocs. There was an additional PhD researching the internal transformation of towns in Roman Italy. The core 8 researchers was given each a region of the early Roman Empire to delve into the historical, inscriptional, coinage and archaeological evidence for urban centres, creating with GIS a gazetteer for each town. One major aim was the most accurate map of cities around 200 AD. There had been partial attempts at such a map. For example, Norman Pounds, 1969, for the provinces of the North Mediterranean and Western Europe. A more ambitious project was a single-handed gazetteer by John Hanson, which appeared in 2016. Hanson's total between 100 and 300 AD came to between 1350 and 1362 official cities. Our project is now able to display a map which benefits from a much larger team. The provisional number of official cities comes to 2,389. The project results are still being analysed and updated. So Hanson had been able to find only 57% of the official cities we have now documented. This was one key result of the project. However, the project had far deeper aims. Firstly, to examine the distribution of cities in each province and trace its evolution from pre-imperial times. Next, to analyze how the Roman urban system functioned. My own research on ancient urbanism began when I first read the 1956 monograph of Ernst Kirsten, The Greek Polis, City-State as an Historical and Geographical Problem of the Mediterranean. Kirsten came to the surprising realization of the small size and territory of the typical homeland Greek city-state, calling it a Dorfstadt or a village town. The average population and dimensions of the majority of Greek city-state territories have subsequently been calculated firstly by Ruschenbusch and later by Mons Hansen. Ruschenbusch in 1985, talking about what Germans call the typical polis, the normal polis, showed that of the 700 to 800 minimum city-states of the classical Aegean, for which we have data, 80% have populations of just 2,000 to 4,000 people, and maximal territories of 5 to 6 kilometers radius. And this is why Kirsten identified the typical homeland polis as a Dorfstadt, or a village state, owing to its small scale. More recently, Hansen and the Polis Project 2004 had more sophisticated and slightly different statistics. The polis, the Greek cities and states in the Aegean and the colonial world, 60% of the homeland polis in the Aegean have a territory of 5 to 6 kilometers radius. 80% of polis, the colonial polis, within an 8-kilometer radius. These distances to the edge of the territory amount to a maximum of 1 to 1.6 hours walking distance, so a very small radius to the boundary of the territory of these city-states. Archaeological research has gone further, and in the Greek homeland of the Aegean has suggested that 70 to 80% of normal polis citizens lived within the city itself, the vast majority farmers. These are agro-towns. This is one of the cities I have been studying over many years, Coronia in Biotia. There would of course be other professions in the city who could be fed from the surplus food produced by the small amount of farmers in the city and a number in the rural areas. Now, a sizable 40% of Hansen's homeland polis had a territory beyond 1 mile radius, which is very suitable for commuter farmers. So in the outer kora or territory, we know there must have been subordinate villages to get efficient land use beyond the 1 mile radius. In the colonial world, Greek cities were often larger than the normal polis, and hence their territories could be wider. But even so, Hansen and his polis project showed that for 4 out of 5, a large part of their landscape could still be farmed in a 1 mile radius from the city centre by urban farmers. One of our PhDs, Peter de Graaf, focused on the typical homeland normal polis in the Aegean. City-sized average, and these figures are actually on the handout that you will be able to get after this lecture, but the city size in the homeland averaged at about 19.5 to 22 hectares, not very large. The population was probably between 24 and 2750 people within the city walls, a small population. I live in a village which has a population of 3,500 actually. For their food, at 1 hectare of cultivated land per person, this population would need a territory radius of about 4.4 to 4.7 kilometers, within 1 mile walking distance. So now the small scale of territory of the Greek normal polis in the Aegean makes sense, because it means that in the homeland, all the land, and in the colonial lands, most of it, could in theory be farmed or managed by urban commuter farmers, living in the city and going out every day to their fields. For the typical normal polis, which housed 70 to 80% of the population, the constraints of distance obviously limited the size of territory in order that urban farmers could adequately get out and exploit their land fully. In fact, human geographers have long ago emphasized that 1 mile travel, about 5 kilometers out to the farmland, is a key range for intensive farming. These calculations also allow for the fact that 20 to 30% of the city-state population were living and farming actually in the countryside. And here we see examples from Hans Lohmann's famous survey in Attica of rural farms. The exaggerated nucleation of citizens inside the normal polis is quite exceptional. Pre-industrial Europe saw an urbanization rate usually 10 to 20%, not 70 to 80. The reasons why so much of a population was nucleated within the city itself does appear to be closely tied to the intense political importance attached in the Greek city-state to residing in the central city itself. So what about the Roman city? Peter de Graaf, in his 2022 study of cities in Roman Italy, has found that the lowest 80% of town sizes, which he terms the normal urbs, had an average extent of 18.8 hectares, but a lower population density compared to Greek polis. This produces a town population of about 1,900 people. Their food needs would require land with a radius of a mere 3.47 kilometers from the town itself. So at first glance, the typical Roman town in Italy had a lower population and needed a smaller radius of farmland to feed itself. But in reality, an ancient historian called Becker-Nielsen, and now our own city project, has shown something very strange. That the territory of the Roman normal urbs, typical town in Italy, and the provinces was usually much larger. How do we account for this much larger territory? Well, let's go first to this Becker-Nielsen challenge. In his 1989 study of towns in the northwest provinces and Italy, The Geography of Power, he found an almost inexplicable trend in terms of the distance between official Roman imperial towns. As we move from Italy through France, Gallia, to Roman Germany and the Netherlands, Germania, he revealed regional forms of urban system. From types A to D, the distances between cities increases, and he argued that the focus of the city moved from an agricultural focus to a fiscal administrative focus as the distances get ever larger for official urban centres. Only in north-central Italy with his type A were towns spaced sufficiently close enough to be comparable with the majority of Greek towns in the homeland and in the colonies. That is, between 11 and 16 kilometres between towns, or 5 to 8 kilometres radius of a territory. So he called these primitive or agricultural towns because the scale would have allowed intensive farming, which could largely have been carried out still from the city. But already in the rest of mainland Italy and Provence, southern France, Mode B was found. Towns are now typically 21 to 37 kilometres apart. He called these colonial and also agricultural. They're not suited to urban commuter farmers because the territory is too big. Rather, these towns with a radius of 10 to 20 kilometres from the town to the border are very typical distances for a market town, a day return market town which we find in Europe right up to recent times, allowing peasants to come in to the market in the town and get back in the same day. But his next three categories, C, D and E, as you go further into France, Gallia and to Germany, we find that towns are spaced between 50 and more than 90 kilometres apart, which means not only that they wouldn't suit commuter farmers, but they're not even reachable as market towns within a day return. So he decided that these towns are basically administrative, to do with collection of tax and other forms of government of the region. And they wouldn't work as market towns, let alone as commuter farmer towns. Well, Becker-Nielsen raises two very interesting issues. So firstly, we see that there's a class of towns which are very much to do with typical market town radius. So they're very much to do with servicing a countryside of farmers. But then we have further out in the remoter provinces a system of towns which seems to be dysfunctional. Not only does it not suit farmers from the city, but it doesn't even work to be a market centre for much of the countryside because the distances are so great. However, the fundamental flaw in Becker-Nielsen's challenge is to take the official Roman town, the self-governing community, as the only form of urbanism in the Roman Empire. This class, shown here, merely represents towns which were granted certain legal and financial privileges by the Roman state. But urban historians of Europe, later periods, have long preferred to recognize towns by what they do, their functional role, not their legal status. Thus it turns out that within the Roman provinces there are a very large number of other town-like settlements whose characteristics match what we expect of a central place in a rural landscape, servicing its rural hinterland. In France, Gallia, French scholars have long been studying such centres, which they call agglomerations secondaires, while for Britannia, scholars have focused on their equivalent, the lesser walled towns. Here we can see the very low density which Becker-Nielsen pointed out as we get away from the heartland of cities of official Roman towns. So let's focus first on this area of low density official towns. Our PhD, Frida Pellegrino, created the following maps. This shows official towns for these two regions, but then these are the unofficial towns. And you might notice they can go up to 130 hectares. And then she produced an integrated map of all the town-like places, official and unofficial, in these provinces. For Anatolia, Turkey, the postdoc Rinsa Willett has also created an official Roman city map. The Thyssen polygons on the right indicate the likely sphere of influence for each city, and the 15-kilometre radius circles mark an ideal market radius, 2 to 3 hours commuting into the market by rural farmers, to give you an idea of how effective these towns would be for servicing day return markets by rural farmers. This shows very well the persistence in Roman times of Greek cities founded in the west of Turkey centuries earlier. We then get a transition to market radius cities, with 15 kilometres working quite well. But then further east, the urban spacing gets wider and spiner, just as we saw before in France and Germany, well beyond effective market servicing. Will it then add likely unofficial towns, which were the black dots now? The white dots are the self-governing cities, the black dots and the blacks show you possible cities, but also secondary agglomerations now, and you'll see we are able to fill Anatolia, Turkey, with quite a number more of unofficial agglomerations, town-like places. But still, there's quite a lot of empty space, too far away from any town to be very helpful as a market centre. So here we think there must be the case that there are rural fairs and markets in these remote regions. They had to take the place of towns for servicing farmers. But we also know that these inland zones had vast imperial estates owned by the emperor. And we know that these large estates often had markets on them. In Iberia, our PhD, Peter Houghton, made a map of official Roman towns. Once again, you can see that before the Romans, there had already been dense urbanization in the Iron Age south, which preconditioned a dense network of Roman towns. These are often closer to commuter farming than a market radius. In the rest of Iberia, we can see that there's quite a good spatial cover across the peninsula, but once more, with a 15-kilometre hexagon here around each town, you can see that there are quite a lot of gaps which don't have easy access to a market official town, a self-governing city. Again, and this wasn't done by Houghton, but we should be imagining there were many unofficial agglomerations, town-like places in these empty spaces, but also we can imagine rural markets and fairs on estates, as we saw in France and in Anatolia. In the North Balkans, Damian Donev, our PhD, found that Rome actually made no effort to create a very effective urban system away from the coast in the hinterland, apart from the frontier garrison towns along the Danube. In the coastal regions, there had already been Greek colonies, and they could maintain urban commuter farmer radii or show market radii, which is the green circle here. So there are those which still Greek towns could have commuter farming, but also there were towns that could now be market focused. But in the interior, there's a very severe lack of an integrated town system in the north part of the Balkans. For the Roman Upper Rhine and the Danube provinces, our PhD Caroline Pasmani mapped both the town-like and the clearly urban centres. So we're seeing all the sites here, not just official towns, but unofficial towns in her map. And again, this time the big purple circle is a 15-kilometre market radius to show you which areas would have been easily served. As we go further south, the upland alpine terrain would have limited urbanisation. On the other hand, the Roman limes, the frontier, clearly the garrison towns were town-like centres, and there's enormous seam-like grouping of these places along the Roman frontier. For the gaps, where we don't seem to have a good access within 15 kilometres to a town, she suggests that there were service centres, road stations, unofficial agglomerations of some other kind. Okay, so if we turn to the new minimal count of cities in the High Roman Empire, we can now add the secondary, unofficial town-like places, and you'll see the map is very much denser, and of course places like France and Britain are beginning to look very much more better covered with an urban network. The provisional total of all towns in the Roman Empire around 200 AD rises to 5,888. And this map is still under construction. You'll see that Sicily is still not quite entered on the map. Moreover, like the Greek city-state, the vast majority of these Roman towns are small, below a 30-hectare line in this sample of closely measured city sizes. Thus, with the addition of our unofficial towns, we've been able to show that for the majority of the Roman provinces and for Italy itself, towns were mostly spaced for market services, rather than the Greek model of the city, which was one of commuter farmer access. So a new form of urban network is typical in the Roman world. The town's clear function is to service a wider rural hinterland. It's a market centre and a centre for other facilities, justice, popular entertainment, specialist craft sales, industrial products, and trade items. This new commercial function requires fewer towns at wider intervals in the landscape. But they're still smaller to some extent than the typical Greek city-state, the normal polis. But then we've already raised a problem here, the shift from a small territory to a larger one. The Greek normal polis has a small territory. The Roman normal urbs is a much larger territory. That seems very odd when we see that in Italy, for example, Roman towns were smaller than the Greek city-state territory. So you would think it needed less territory to feed itself than the Greek town. But there's a very central difference between the Greek and the Roman town and their territories. The Greek homeland normal polis was an abnormal community. Generally, the majority of the city inhabitants were farmers. So their needs could be met mostly within a 5-kilometre farmer radius from the city. For a typical Roman town or normal urbs, the total hectares to feed the about 1,900 people requires a much, sorry, I made a mistake here, this is not the right figure, it should be 3.5 radius, not 7.7. So 3.5 radius would feed 1,900 people. Furthermore, since urbanization rates for Roman cities are generally set at 10 to 20%, in contrast to the Greek homeland polis, 70 to 80%, Because most of the people in the Roman town were not farmers, you need to have in the countryside mass of people who are making food for the city. So 1,900 people would need 9,500 to 19,000 in the total territory, town and country, because instead of 70 to 80% living in the Greek city, 70 to 80% of Romans are living in the countryside, and the city is not producing most of its food. So if every person needs about a hectare of food in the Roman town, the population needs 50% land use, a much wider territory, 8 to 11 kilometers. So we move from a small territory in the Greek polis for the commuter radius farmers to a much bigger territory because the city is largely not making any food. It has to have a big hinterland of farmers to feed itself. And this fits well with our observed radius that Roman towns mostly seem to have a much wider territory, not 5 kilometers or less, but 15 kilometers to its borders, in order to have enough farmers to pay for the 80% of the town residents who are not farmers. And of course, because it's a bit wider than the 8 to 11, it means that the countryside could also produce extra food than just to feed its own town, but to pay taxes and to also get in some trade items. This difference locates the Roman level similar to that argued for pre-modern Europe as a whole, of 10 to 20% urbanization. So Roman urbanization, for most cases, is like a pre-modern town, because it possesses a small minority of full-time farmers. The majority are rentier landowners, craftspeople, tradespeople, lawyers, professional classes. So we're beginning to the Roman town is quite different from the Greek town, much more like a pre-modern European town, medieval, early modern. So are we saying that the typical Roman town looks like the medieval European city? No. Why? Because of this and other bits of evidence. In a listing of the male free population of Herculaneum, freedmen, former slaves, are in a majority. Wallace Hadler agrees with my colleague Luc Delich and Peter Garnsey, considers that other Roman towns also had a minority of 3 citizens compared to slaves and freedmen, the so-called liberty. Freedmen and slaves are intimately tied to the households of citizen elite families in the Roman world, and you can read about this in an excellent book by Murritson called The Freedmen in the Roman World. So freed people were central figures in trade, industry, and finance. In fact, archaeologically, the typical Roman town is not like the medieval town in Europe because it's dominated by the domus, the rich house of the wealthy citizens who are the spiders at the heart of this economic web, and their clients, the freedmen and slaves. So the normal polis and the normal urbs populations were not far apart in size, but their social and economic structure differed fundamentally, and this has deep implications for the size of their territory. Roman civitas boundaries were much in excess of the Greek homeland polis radius, but this wide market radius allowed regular food supplies to be brought in from the rural farmers, especially on a day return, to feed a predominantly non-farming city population. And understandably, the oligarchic Roman political system was very happy to see the troublesome urban plebs of the classical Greek polis thrown out, expelled to the countryside, and replaced by a city-compliant population of the rich and their clients. Our analysis has been taken further in another aspect of Peter de Graaf's PhD and now book. And you can see a lot of the detail in the handout, which is taken from his book that I've been talking about and I will talk about in a minute. Peter de Graaf's analysis of published city plans from Roman Italy this is the handout that you will get, show that although Roman towns had more domestic space and less public space, the typical house size in a Roman town is much larger than in classical Greece, with a larger group of occupants. The importance of the townhouses of a rich class compared to the smaller dwellings of the lower classes is being emphasized in the Roman town. So this is not the agro town of ancient Greece, where at least half of the classical cities had a form of democracy, at least for the middling and wealthier farmers. Hence their desire to live in the centre of political life, and where most people lived in rather identical smallish homes, such as here in Greek Olympos. During the intermediate Hellenistic era in the Greek world, contemporary with the later Roman Republic in Italy, there was the growth of an international proto-capitalist economy, and in Hellenistic times, growing disparities in wealth. And it begins to create a new investment-focused, socially polarized society, symbolized through the rise of large townhouses with separate quarters and access routes for the elite residents, their visitors and guests, and their service staff. So we move from a Greek, typically small, integrated house to a larger house for the wealthier Roman citizens, where the access routes and access analysis divides away the service staff, the servants and the slaves, so they don't meet the guests who are being entertained in the lavish rooms for dining and reception. So towns have a new infrastructure, and also in the country we see the rise of larger Hellenistic and then Roman villa estates becoming more and more common. And the infrastructure of towns shows that the elite houses are surrounded by small flats and houses belonging to their clients, their slaves, their freedmen, in modular units across the urban surface. And here we see an analysis of this trend, this change in Hellenistic and earlier Roman times, to this kind of city plan with the domus, the large houses of the wealthy members of society, surrounded by the small apartments and shops, often owned by slaves and freedmen who were connected, tied to the wealthy houses. And this was discussed very well by Monica Trumper with this example in Delos, financial hub of contemporary with the late Roman Republic. And this change is what de Graaf has called gentrification, to use a modern term, a changed townscape. And the Roman elites learned rapidly from these transformations in the neighboring Hellenistic world to plan their own towns, as Roman expansion gradually absorbed Hellenistic states and cities piece by piece. So this is Roman society, run by a very large class of wealthy citizens who over the later Roman Republic have enlarged their traditional control of extensive estates to develop extensive portfolios in financial services, industry and trade, often spanning investments across provinces, as we see from the letters of Cicero. We have now seen how Roman townhouses dominate a city run by members of the elite. Clustered around their urban mansions, and even in parts of them, we see their clients, the lesser tradesmen and other professions, especially their freedmen, liberty. Roman politics had no space for Greek democracy. Most of the working class farmers were expelled from the city, leaving just a small population of free citizens servicing a part of the towns and the elite's needs for food, but most of the needs would have been from food from the rural farmers and from their everyday shopping and production would have come from the dependent class of slaves and freedmen who were intimately connected to the urban elite. So this could never be a parallel to the Italian medieval city-state, as it was born in north and central Italy, where instead we see a burgeoning capitalist, free middle class of merchants, bankers, craftsmen. What they did was to overturn the rule of that traditional landed aristocracy, and they made 150 citizen republics by the late Middle Ages. The rise of a form of proto-capitalism in the Roman world was kept tightly in the grasp of the former landed elite as they led a globalizing economic revolution. Thank you very much. Efaristo Poli.
Yes, John, thank you. Thank you very much. It was, it was amazing. The whole project is amazing. And I think he has actually contributed greatly to our knowledge for the Roman world. Unfortunately, you will not, because it's the team's restriction, you can phrase your questions through the chat. So if you have the kindness to write your questions, and we will read them to John. But until we do that, I can start with some questions, and of course, Yanis and Meliana or Despina, if they want to contribute. I will start from this aspect of secondary settlements, which I find very interesting, and I think it can actually change the way we see the map of the Roman Empire. I mean, it's very interesting in terms of what also might imply about the economy of the Roman world. What I wanted to ask you is, what are the basic parameters that you use to classify, or you and the team and the rest of the team, that you use to classify or identify something as a secondary settlement? And where is the dividing line between, let's say, this kind of settlement and a hamlet or a village? I want to hear your opinion about that.
Yes, so obviously the official towns have always been easy because they have legal status, so we have inscriptions and letters and other evidence listing towns, and the ancient geographers list towns. So put all that together. Also, you have coinage. Towns have a right to mint their own coins. So through those sources, official towns can mostly be listed, and they agree fairly well with ancient historians' lists of towns as well. Say 500 for Anatolia, 500 for North Africa. Those sources, ancient sources, are very close to the actual number of official towns. But what had been discovered long ago by particularly French scholars was that they had a countryside with not so many official towns, but many places which were quite big. They had city walls, they had fora, they had magistrates as well, and they had industry, and they had public buildings, and they looked like a town. But because the legal status was a distinct question in the Roman Empire, of course, it had an advantage because you could collect taxes and income. So there was a great desire for any town to want to be recognized with a charter to be legal, because then it could increase its income. But this doesn't seem to have stopped pretty well an equal number of towns from surviving and flourishing without legal status. And of course, how do we recognize them as archaeologists? Well, of course, there's an intermediate step. I mentioned magistrates. So we can show that some of these definitely have inscriptions showing that they had a town council and officials, just like the official towns. But also then we look at size. So I think once you get beyond 10 hectares, it's worth considering whether there's evidence for industrial production, for markets, for trade goods, for public buildings, and all these other features that suggest that these are serving as central places for their territory and all. And as we've seen, the official towns are very often too far apart, so that the rural farmers would have had great difficulty in selling their produce and getting money to pay their taxes. So the team were asked to investigate all the places which were official, but also to look at the distribution distribution of all the sites which are of a certain size, and then to look at the archaeological evidence to see, and also the epigraphic evidence to see if we could argue that they also should fall into the category of towns in functional and size terms. There are indeed some examples which are as small as 5 hectares in Iberia, for example, which nonetheless have significant public buildings, walls, and clearly are functioning for a local community. But this is quite rare, and it's probably due to the presence of some very wealthy person nearby who wants to make the local community very grand by spending money to enhance his own reputation. Mostly we look to places from 10 hectares and above as potentially being town-like, and then see if they're actually still big villages or they have other functions that you can get from the archaeological evidence or from inscriptional evidence.
Yes. Well, you know, I mean, I was thinking about the concept of the secondary settlement, and well, it can actually very well, and you know that my interest lies in North Greece, and actually the concept may well fit in this kind of settlements that we found on the ground in North Greece, and they are not, we cannot exactly class them as cities, or we don't know which town it is, but they actually are, a lot of them actually in Western Macedonia, and they may fit well, very well in this concept of this intermediate, I don't know, settlements that is between bigger centers and has the architecture, has the special layout, has probably the artisanal and the industrial infrastructure, but we don't know anything more about it. So it's a very interesting concept. So I mean, before I can go on forever.
I think the main thing is what we seem to, we have a model, I suppose, or at least my colleague Luc de Licht already published this, but the model is that the typical Roman town is like a medieval or early modern market town.
Yes.
So its main role is to service a territory which is not too big and not too small. Because they're mostly not farmers, it must be big enough to have enough farmers to feed it, but also because they need the farmers to come in, the territory must not be too large so that the farmers can come in, ideally even within a day, and get home without having to spend money renting a place to stay, and with all sorts of dangers. So this kind of very typical market town with a radius of 2 to 3 hours on foot, we think there's a module across the empire, and that most Roman towns are basically market towns, like we see in medieval Europe and early modern Europe, with their pretty well most of what they do is to service their hinterland. They're not manufacturing centers. They're not commercial centers in any modern sense. They're not producing mostly things to send abroad or major industrial production. Their main role is to service their rural hinterland. And then there are exceptional places, usually larger towns, which do these other things, where the trade is focused and where industry may be focused, and they have an international perspective. But the big difference I try to emphasize in this lecture is that they're not like a medieval and early modern European town, because the social structure is so totally different. It's not an open society. It's controlled by the elite and by their people, because freed people, liberati, are actually expected to do a lot of work for their former owners. So basically, the city is dominated by the wealthy, and they cannot develop a real middle class, and hence the politics can't change.
Yes, thank you, John. Before I give before Yanis wants to ask a question, but before that, we have a question in the Q&A from Alexandra Theodore, who asks, will this GIS data be made available online for further research? Else, how will the academic community benefit of it, or in what format or formats? Also, will there be a sequel on the project? And she says, in my opinion, it should be a continuous work in progress. If affirmative, how can one become a collaborator? Thank you.
Yes,
this is from Alexandra.
Absolutely, they're there. It was one of the items in the European Research Council grant was that we would create an open database of all these 6,000 towns with all the information, which is of the size, the publications, coin evidence for public buildings, the number of buildings, dimensions of the forum. All this information was collected by the team, and this is all in the database, and the database will be publicly available as soon as we finish just some last elements. So my colleague Luc de Lick was published Egypt recently, and he's just finishing off some areas of North Africa. And there's a little bit of work to do with Sicily. And then the whole database will be available to anybody and everybody to see all the information up to date that we have. In terms of the next stage, I do have a project in mind, which is to try to compare this, but within Greece itself, to Byzantine, Ottoman, and early modern urbanism. So to take the story in Greece forward in time and to look at the changes in urbanism and how this helps us to understand how cities relate to society. And part of that plan is also to look at certain issues to do with the modern city, which are much discussed, the problems and advantages of modern cities, to what extent we can perhaps learn or compare with the past. That's not just Greek and Roman, but also Byzantine and Ottoman towns. So that's the project that we're trying to get funding for at the moment, actually, is because of scale that would be confined to Greece, but it has it takes from the archaic period up to 1900 AD, if we get some money for it.
Indeed, yeah. Yanni, if you excuse me, we have another question in Q&A. I'll do the question and then you can ask. Okay. So it's from Panagiotis Koutakis, who asks, do we have data about the existence of courtrooms in all these Roman cities? How many courtrooms were there and how important was for the city status to have a courtroom?
Yes. So the public buildings are listed by type and the dimensions from whether they've been mapped, planned, excavated. So it's possible to look at the variable dimensions of basilicas and other major buildings which could have served for that function. The one very important thing is the way in which usually the circuit of the governor and of other officials very much enhance the status of the town and changed its character in many ways and gave it great advantages if a city was official and therefore could act as a place where the law could be carried out not only locally for the region, but also that the governor might also visit this place in a circuit. And I think there's a famous quote from Libanius, I think it's Libanius, anyway, one of the Roman authors, about the impact of having court cases in the city and how it boosts the economy and the number of people visiting and bringing income to the town and fairs and all sorts of things that happen. So the presence of a court was something which obviously had to do with the official status of the town. And if you were one of those towns with a court which was visited in the circuit of the governor, that was even more important and even more relevant to the role of the town and its wealth and its catchment, essentially. So that's yes, it is a very important aspect, which was to the advantage of official towns, along with their ability to raise revenue, which would mean that towns were continuously trying to ask the emperor to be elevated to official status.
Okay, thank you. And Yanni, you are you can ask the question here.
Yes, thank you very much for the stimulating presentation. The way I understood the whole line of reasoning is that the basic criterion is how large the city is, and based on that, we can calculate the area that should be controlled in order to self-sustain itself, to provide
Yes.
food for the people. Now,
yeah, I mean, you're right. There are two stages. The first one's a map of cities, and then we decided we have unofficial cities. So we make a map when we get an idea. But the next thing was also how they could service the countryside by using the mapped data, the GIS data. Could they act usefully as centers for the countryside? The next question is the one that you're raising, which is actually to do with how they fed themselves. And that's that balance between how many farmers are normally in the city and how many do we need in the countryside to support a town of about 2,000 people, the typical size. Yeah.
In fact,
yes.
The question, my question comes right here. I mean that this calculation, isn't it a little bit modest? I mean, we have to presuppose that the area around the city, the only reason is self-sustenance. Don't we have to calculate also the surplus? And if we start thinking something like that a city should control more area in order to have surplus, is there any change in the interpretive model if we start calculating something like that?
Yes, I mean, we took an average of 50% cultivated. In order to deal, obviously, we have to make some generalizations with almost 6,000 cities. So we generalized that if we took, say, 50% in cultivation, then how would the system work? And then we see that actually, in order to have a safe balance and still have a surplus for people to pay taxes, to have imports, then we probably have a territory which is a bit larger than the necessary territory. So on average, 8 to 11 kilometer radius, say 15 kilometer radius or more, would give you a surplus. And in good years, you might be able to crop more than 50%, or in rich areas, you might be able to do so. So over time, the percentage of land in cultivation might have risen or fallen. And this means that it could have put this system at risk, or it could have meant that there was a healthy surplus and indeed there wasn't too much pressure on the land. So there is this balance between setting a level roughly which might be a generalizing level. And what we see if we set this level of about 1 hectare to feed a person and 50% land in use as an average, then we find that we have a territory, say, of 15 kilometer radius, which would produce a surplus regularly and safely over and above the needs of the town. So that's just a general model, but it does fit very well with the fact that we do seem to have this normal herbs, which roughly has that kind of a scale of territory around it. And this means that it does explain the wide size of the Roman territory compared to the Greek Cora territory, but roughly the scales are about right with those general figures. In detail, of course, there might be areas with more than 50% in cultivation or much less depending on fertility. So it was simply to put forward a model, a very general model with some very broad parameters so that we could simulate a system like the one we find, which is we have these small territory Greek polis states in the homeland, and we have these large territory Roman town territory in the imperial provinces, and we think we've got 70 to 80% urbanization in Greece, 70 to 80% ruralization in the Roman world, and the figures are roughly okay. And the interesting detail would be where we see local variation, and where we may see there might have been more productivity or less productivity, and the territories might have to have been larger or they could have been smaller. And as we showed in the maps, of course, in some cases, the Roman territory was much smaller. In some cases, it was very much larger. And so we have to imagine that there were many unofficial places, but there were markets and fairs in the countryside, etc. So the idea is to set up these general models which roughly explain the main trends in the data. But in reality, each city probably had its own historical peculiarities, really. And then we can begin to look in detail at their territory and their size and do a particular calculation for each one. I hope that was made it a little bit clearer about what we
thank you.
did.
And one last question. All this data that you showed us about the small towns in between the official towns, I'm guessing that most of them are based on surveys and not excavations. Am I right?
It depends. I mean, in France, there is an immense history back to the 19th century of excavation. So in fact, although survey has enriched this picture, a lot of the picture in France has come also from 150 years of excavations by French archaeologists. So it is a good mixture. And the same would go for Germany and the Netherlands, actually. And a lot of Britain, of course, has seen all sorts of excavations. So in Iberia, rather less so. And that may be why at the moment Peter Houghton wasn't able to make a map of unofficial towns so easily. So we don't actually have that. We only have the official towns which he studied. So it does depend upon the early arrival of interest in excavating in towns and in mapping them, even before survey came in. So survey is much more important in areas with rather lower investment in archaeology. North Africa, for example, a great deal has been done with their photographs and with other forms of mapping because the excavations have only progressed rather in a limited way there. But luckily, North Africa, air photographs, etc., and GIS studies are able to make up a lot of help with defining the size of towns. And the students and the postdocs on our project often were able to compare plans made on the ground and from excavation with Google Earth and to actually correct them and show that the scales were wrong or the calculations were wrong, and probably the size of the Roman town probably needed to be altered by using GIS on air photographs.
Okay, thank you, John. Meliana, there is a question, if you allow me, in the Q&A. It's an actually very interesting question, John, by Angel Grigorov.
Yes.
Who asks, can you please expand on the concept of proto-caped capitalism, especially how it squares with the evidence for free market economy within the amphora trade, and the fact that occupational profiles of Roman cities have been shown to match those of today? This is from Angel.
Yeah. I think that the official ancient sources tend to emphasize that the Roman elite were landowners and that getting involved in trade and industry was a dirty job that wasn't appropriate for the elite of citizens. And that's the kind of image that they gave to themselves. But the more we have looked into the way in which business, commerce, and industry were organized by tracing the stamps on tiles or on drains, by looking at the setup for pottery production, by looking at the financial evidence found on all sorts of evidence, like on delos, on ceilings for movable goods, we realize that actually as the Roman Empire grew through the Republic, the landed elite began to take advantage increasingly of the profits that could be made by investing abroad. And we can see that, particularly in Cicero, who pretty well says, look, we've got Sicily. This is the place to go. You can go yourself, or you can send your people there, or put money into it. And you're going to do very well out of this province of Sicily. And you can see that Cicero has an enormous portfolio all over the empire of properties, investments, that he's got his own people, his freedmen and slaves doing business for him over the empire. And he's not unusual. So basically, it seems as if through the Roman Republic, increasingly, the elite kept control of power by investing in other forms of income than land, by investing in trade and industry, particularly using their slaves and freed people to help them moving around, doing all this work for them. And that really prevented a strong middle class to develop, as opposed to medieval Europe, where we do get a bourgeoisie who begin more and more important, and they take over the town essentially, and from the aristocratic landed elite. This couldn't happen in the Roman world, and it's generally agreed there isn't such a thing as a Roman middle class, which has real influence and power. So they kept a very tight grip on the sources of wealth. And I think this goes back to Hellenistic times, and something that interests me very much in my own work in Greece is the evidence from epigraphy that we find that elites are much more mobile under the diadokoi, under the Hellenistic states. It was possible to become a citizen on many different city-states, to own land, to invest in these areas, to be given special status, honorific statues, all sorts of things. So you see there becomes an international elite of wealthy people in Hellenistic times, and money is moving and people are accumulating capital. I mean, even in Boeotia, we have a very rich epigraphic record. You can see that there are people, including women, who are lending vast sums of money to cities to bail them out in certain circumstances and getting statues in their honor. So you see this development of what I would call proto-capitalism, which is that there is a possibility, as the boundaries are broken down, for people to be able to move money around and to make money and store it as capital. And they are encouraged by the traditional elite who want to get into this act. For example, one of my cities, Thespiae, amazingly, it's full of these people called negotiatores in the late Republic and in the early Empire, business people, Italian business people. There are so many Italian business people in Thespiae that the local aristocrats build a gymnasium for the Italian businessmen and pay for their oil. Now, could you imagine in 5th century Greece something like that happening? I mean, it's just impossible to imagine such a world. It's more like the modern world where, local business people in the town are trying to curry favor with Elon Musk or something like that by creating all sorts of opportunities for international business people. So I see this as developing in Hellenistic times, where the boundaries between states are breaking down, but people are beginning to invest in capital, money, and moving their money around, and they have portfolios like a modern business people. And they keep really a firm grip on the Roman city and on Roman politics. So it never could become a proper democracy. And we could never have a proper middle class. And that's the difference from the city-state of medieval Italy, where all those things did happen and obviously lead on to modern democracy and the modern world. Well, until we went back with people like Trump, of course.
Yes, well, yeah. So,
oh, and sorry, and one symptom of that,
yes,
I showed was the change in houses. There is a radical change in the type of houses that people have in towns, which marks the ostentatious rise of this urban elite. Demosthenes said that, and you might say, well, he was a politician, can we believe him? But when you look at Hellenistic houses, you do see these changes in the towns towards the development of much larger, more elaborate residences for this new elite. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about this thing you said about the city as a base of power for urban elites and the expulsion of the poor in the countryside. Do you still think that the concept of the service city that was fashionable, once, you think is still relevant, or in your model doesn't fit anymore?
If we look at the whole nature of these 6,000 towns, as I said earlier, I think that the modular normal town is a market center for a defined region. The Cora, the Civitas, its main role is to provide services and to organize the countryside around it. It depends on its countryside completely. Its role as a producer of craft work and of industrial commercial activity is primarily focused on its own countryside. the part of the town which is involved with producing goods for export in terms of industry, commerce is very small. And that is something that's focused in larger cities and is brought by traders coming into these communities. So yes, basically a service city, but also because the people who own a lot of the land live there, it also is a controlling point for the elite who have land in the countryside, which they use their own estates to feed the town and also to supply some of the export which is needed to pay for imports. The peasants mostly must have produced for the town, rather than their small products would unlikely have been very useful for long distance trade. That must have been something which the large landowners could have got involved in. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, if there are no other questions, and so John, we have to thank you. It was really interesting, and the whole project was interesting. We can go on forever. I mean, write down 10 questions, but I mean, I don't want to monopolize the discussion. It's a project that, as Alexandra said, I mean, it needs, open data for all of us that we deal with urbanization and landscape studies to feed on and to further.
Sorry, I need to add one thing.
Yes, please.
Is that some of these studies have been published already. So I have a paper that I will make available to you, which summarizes a lot of this paper. But the PhDs and the postdocs, most of them have published, or you can obtain their data. So the study of France and Britain is a book. It's a published book. The study of Anatolia is a published book. So is the study of Iberia, Italy. Peter de Graaf's book on the internal structure of Roman Italy will appear quite soon. So gradually, much of this work, and of course for Greece, our postdoc Michalis Karambinis has published several articles on the Roman towns of Greece. So much of this work on the local detail is published. And I think in the article, which I'll make available to everybody through you, I give the references to the publications which have already appeared for the regional case studies,
okay.
Which is all before we get to the database. But this means a lot of this material is available.
Article. Are you going to send me the article?
I'll send you the article, the PDF link.
So whoever is interested, he can send me an email. They can find the emails from my GIS Athena website. So they can email me, and I can set up a link for anyone who's interested to download the article. So with this, John, thank you very much. And definitely it was a very interesting project. And hopefully you will produce more and more on Boeotia and Greek archaeology. And we'll all be grateful and thankful for your work. So thank you. And for all the people who are online, thank you for attending. I want to remind you that our next lecture will be at the beginning of June by Quentin Drouillard, who will have a more technical GIS subject. But you can we will inform you, and we will have all the updates in our webpage, in our Facebook. So once more, thank you. And hopefully we'll see you in our next lecture. John, thank you once more. Thank you.
Ego, Efaristo.
Excellent.